Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry to actually see that European elections, true to their reputation, are not really raising as much interest as they deserve, judging by the crowd, which I hope will eventually come back to listen to this brilliant panel that we have with us this afternoon. My name is Ockrent. I'm a journalist and writer based in Paris. To my left, Cathryn, Clüver, Ashbrook, with the Bertelsmann Foundation, Loukas, Tsoukalis, who runs ELIAMEP, the Greek think tank, Nico, Lange, who is with the Munich Security Conference, Cathryn, Fieschi, with the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, and Piotr, Buras, who runs the Warsaw Bureau of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Between the 6th and the 9th of June, 360 million Europeans will be asked to go and vote to elect a new European Parliament. And traditionally, these elections are not raising much interest in each of our 27 countries, but the questions this year around and the challenges that the EU has to face are likely to make these elections, or at least their results, more interesting. We see the same shift to the right in most of our European societies. We have the war in Ukraine. Has that become a common European war or not? We have the climate challenge. We have the disinformation challenge. I was just reading that the Belgian government is opening up a judicial investigation into corruption of Euro MPs and massive Russian disinformation campaigns. And of course, we have, again, this difficulty of our national governments to try and raise interest for these elections, which will inevitably modify the balance of power between the various political parties in Strasbourg and Brussels. So let me ask first, Loukas, how do you see, what is do we have now, as European citizens, common priorities, or do we still have our national differences and idiosyncrasies that play their part?
I mean, let me start, thank you, Christine. Let me start with the obvious. I mean, we heard in previous panels, and I suppose most of us in this room would agree, that we need a stronger and more united Europe. You need a stronger and more united Europe to face the main challenges ahead of us, and they are also known to all of us. I mean, I can only remind you of three basic ones. One is we need to add a defense dimension to what used to be a peace project. That's big. Second, we need to face an existential challenge, which is climate change. Third, we need to deal with Europe's lagging in technology. And our dependence in technology translates into dependence in the defense field in terms of democracy, human rights, and so on. Okay, now we need a stronger and more united Europe. Opinion polls tell us that we should expect a shift to the right. Right-wing parties, or far right-wing parties, are going to increase their share of the vote. Now, those parties are not united among themselves, but they have one key characteristic, and that is they are nationalists. So they are unlikely to defend common European stance on any of those issues. So we have a crucial dilemma to face. How do you reconcile needs with capabilities? And that, I think, is one of the key issues facing Europe today. We know what we need we have no idea as to how to achieve it. And it's not only because there's going to be a shift to the right, but also because we know that many of our national governments are extremely weak. And thinking about the future and thinking about Europe is an extremely expensive luxury when you're trying to survive the next day in power at home. So that's the situation, it seems to me, and it doesn't look very sunny, but that's where we are.
Piotr, there has been sunshine in Poland, of all places, with indeed a shift away to some degree from what has been a populist, nationalist regime that has in particular contaminated the judiciary. And you've been voting many times over the past few months. What do you make of, what are the stakes for those Poles who will bother to go and vote once again in June?
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I think you rightly point to this major shift which happened in Poland in October last year, that pro-European forces, after 8 years of populists in power, won the majority and formed a government. But I think the prevailing feeling or prevailing sense in Warsaw or in Poland these days is that of a vulnerability of this victory. And you referred to the previous elections. We had the local municipality elections last weekend. The PIS party, the populist and increasingly anti-European right-wing party, came first again. So basically there hasn't been any major shift when it comes to the popularity of the political party since October. So that was the same, basically almost the same result was reflected in these local elections. And we have a situation which kind of contradicts this sometimes, in the foreign media prevailing narrative of Poland being now, clearly on the track towards, European leadership and pro-European positions, because we have a very strong opposition consisting of two anti-European parties, and the whole opposition is anti-European, so basically PIS and the Confederation, the far-right party. So we have a polarization between the government and the opposition along the line of pro-European, anti-European. And we have a situation where, when I spoke quite recently with a high-level Polish politician from the ruling coalition, who told me basically the main threat, because we are talking here about main challenges, main priorities, the main threat is populism. He didn't refer to economic security. He didn't refer to other issues which are very much on the minds of experts and policymakers. He said we need to fight populism, and then so what is behind? Behind is also a certain cautiousness when it comes to coming up with a very proactive pro-European agenda. So if you look at the government of Donald Tusk today and how he positions himself on migration, on Green Deal, on opening of trade with Ukraine and other issues, so you would notice that there is a lot of hesitance to embrace an extremely pro-European, pro-federalist, whatever position. So we have a situation, and I think Poland is a very good example of that we have this discussion, and colleagues in the previous panels referred to this phenomenon, that we have a great transition coming up, right? I mean, there's something really extremely important and fundamental is going to happen with the European project if we are to implement at least half of those priorities which we mentioned in the previous panels. And there is on the pro-European side, there is a huge fear that addressing these issues in the electoral campaign and in the public discourse at large could backfire. So there is a kind of widening gap between our ambitions and our ability to discuss also the trade-offs, as Yanis said, and the sometimes perhaps unintended consequences of what could this great transition entail. For example, when it comes to the relation between the state and market, when it comes to the national relation between national sovereignty and supranationalism, the role of the Commission versus the role of the member states, that there would be a massive shift, regardless of whether we have a treaty change or not. But we are not, for the reason that still this populist fear, a populist threat, is considered to be very, very dangerous and very substantial. There is a much less, willingness to engage with this debate. Sorry, I shouldn't have stopped now.
So you either have 15 minutes to conclude the session, or we can stop and proceed later. Whatever you prefer.
I think 15 minutes.
Okay, you keep 15 minutes.
I've just been told by our friend here that there's again a power issue here in Delphi. So we have 15 minutes as we are actually working on generators. 15 minutes. So I start with you, Cathryn, because you work on populism. One question. Is the anti-European motivation still the main one for populist parties throughout Europe? Please be synthetic. We have little time and very limited electricity.
We'll need a break.
Okay, let's proceed.
Okay. So I think that not all populists are the same. So we do have two groups in the European Parliament, and I think that these groups, although neither of them is particularly likable, you have group Identity and Democracy, where you would find the Marine Le Pens and the Salvinis and so on, who are much more really Eurosceptic and anti-European than the other group, that to some extent has rallied to the idea that they can wield a certain amount of power through this group, through ECR. So I would argue that they're not exactly the same. I do think that what is important, though, is something that's been alluded to already here, which is that we definitely will find ourselves in a European Parliament where these two groups, plus the European People's Party, the so-called center-right, will actually have a slight majority. Not necessarily a massive majority, but enough of a majority to act potentially as a drag on the kind of agenda that we need to pursue and a curtailment on the kind of collective power that we would need right now to achieve our aims as Europeans.
Cathryn, let me turn to you. It seems that your government is in a complicated situation, complicated coalition.
Very diplomatic way to say
that. Yes, I think so too. But on both extremes, both the extreme right and the extreme left, there is a rise of anti-European motivations and even rather violent. What do you make of that? What can be the result in June?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous moment for Europe for Germany because two things are happening. You alluded to it. This coalition is already picking itself apart, never really found its own centering, and is already gearing up toward the 2025 election. So they're already hedging for coalition partners, if you will. They're already adjusting messaging. And in so doing, they're giving enough space for the populists that, exactly as you're noting, are being undercut by some of the strategic elements that Cathryn and I were discussing before and have discussed in the past, that there's sort of the strategic connection between populists across Europe and some of the strategies being used in the United States, that are undergirded by political violence, meaning to say bringing protests onto the streets that start with legitimate grievance. So the agricultural question, which will be a fundamental question for a next parliament, a next commission to address, issues with the cap and in sort of the global atmosphere, completely undercut. You can't rent tractors, by the way, in Germany right now, because far-right thugs have begun to rent tractors, dress up as farmers, and cause the kind of fray, the kind of street violence, the kind of upsurge. And so what Cathryn was describing is sort of the political view, I think, of what some of these parties will try to do within the European Parliament is thwart progress, say no, stall out. And that's sort of the strategy that is beginning to bind the far left and the far right in Germany. And because the government per se is either obsessed with itself, cannot map out a progressive vision for the country. And again, this is a moment where the fundamental business model of the European Union is at stake. Is interdependence, is working together, is compromise still something that can withstand the pressures of the major global powers? That should be the fundamental message in an electoral campaign. This government, so focused in and of itself, is lending power, is lending at least space to the dimensions on either side, making particularly, and the focus is not so much on the European elections in Germany, but on the Länder elections that follow almost immediately after, is giving sort of the populist parties too much space in the debate.
Nico, how do you assess the impact of Russian interference? Cathryn was mentioning the agricultural difficulties. We know in France, for instance, that there has been that Russian trolls have been stirring up French farmers' anger over the past few weeks. What is your assessment on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's a sign of the significance of European Parliament elections if at the conference in Europe, after a former US general and CIA director, when we switched to European Parliament elections, everybody's leaving the room. And secondly, I do not think it's helpful when we talk about Russian interference that we try to frame the European Parliament elections as a fight against pro-Europeans, against anti-Europeans, or as a populists against non-populists. I think there are serious issues that need to be discussed. And there are political issues that need not only to be discussed, that need also to be solved. And the European Union has not been particularly good at solving very significant problems. And I would like to focus the discussion very much on that in the electoral campaign and not so much scaring people with how difficult it might be if there are more populists, because that's very exploitable from a Russian point of view. It is, I think, also exploitable in the combination that was described, US and European social nationalists, populists connecting with each other. They are, of course, also connecting to certain Russian narratives, especially when it comes to migration, to anti-LGBT, to social conservatism, and to mostly Ukraine. But I'm afraid the biggest Russian interference into the European Parliament elections is what is going on in Ukraine right now, where Russia is trying to trigger a new migration wave just in the weeks that are leading to the European Parliament elections, and where the European leaders are looking at each other, basically saying it would be great if somebody would actually do something about it. And we might be, in 6 weeks from now, we might be in a world where pictures of millions of people on the move from Ukraine into the European Union will be on our TV screens, and that might be a huge Russian influence to the European Parliament elections.
And not only from Ukraine, if I may, but also from Niger and Mali.
Yes, but I mean, Ukraine will be basically about, ironically, because we are out of power in 7 minutes, but Ukraine will basically without electricity in 7 to 10 days from now. And if you are living there with a family, with children, with elder people, I mean, even if you held out all of the time in Kharkiv or in Poltava or in any other big city of Ukraine, I mean, what can you do? You will be on the move in 2 weeks from now. And I do not see that the European Union or that the European governments are doing something about this right now. This is the biggest interference. And one last sentence about the effect of the European Parliament elections. In many countries, if not in all, those are national elections of second-order importance. People do not really care much about the European Parliament. But if you look in detail, then you will see in Germany, the government will be very far, the three parties in government will be very far away from a majority in the result of the European Parliament elections. This will be a discussion about the Chancellor, about the government, if they can stay or not. And in France, the Rassemblement National will be with a large margin, very likely the biggest party. So the weak national governments we were discussing will be at least even weaker than now in Germany and in France after the European Parliament elections.
One question to the five of you. To what extent the war in Ukraine is indeed a European war that our politicians in the 27 countries would promote as a common concern and a common need for more support to Ukraine, which of course entails more defense spending and more priorities than, you know, fighting inflation, helping farmers, and so on and so forth. Loukas.
Okay, very quick telegraphic answer is that Europe is taking over increasingly from the United States the support of Ukraine in this war, and even more so if Mr. Trump is elected to power again. Yet, Europe has been unable to play any significant role in influencing developments in Ukraine, in playing the role of a mediating power or whatever. It is other powers that decide what essentially happens in Ukraine, and less so Europe.
Cathryn, for you, is the war, is that a major argument that is being used in the European campaign by...
It could be. It is the litmus test, fundamentally, if the world's greatest peace project can hold. And de facto, I think communitarization, as we call it in bubble speak, this idea that you pool resources, you make them more efficient, you make them redistributed, could be a strong argument for those countries who feel that they are being asked to step up in their singularity. It's, I think, a strong potential comment to make to those who fear for their fiscal security, who feel that they're going to be bled out. But the problem is, and this gets precisely to Loukas' point, what does that buy? What does that sacrifice on the European end buy? And if those arguments aren't made fundamentally clear in the way that Nico Lange does it on his Twitter feed every single day, then that argument falls apart completely, and the Ukraine skeptics, the Ukraine support skeptics, will win the day.
Cathryn?
Well, I think, you know, France is a good example here because Macron, whether this was, you know, cynical or not, the fact is that, you know, he has very much nailed his colors to the mast now in terms of making this a European war, a war on European soil. He's conjured up, you know, some would say awkwardly, you know, the idea of sending troops, and therefore he's made the reality of war, he's brought the reality of war, I think, closer to certainly the French public. But the fact is that, you know, these things in a very illustrative moment, you know, this was the conversation until, of course, the French public, the new figures on the French public deficit appeared, and all of a sudden, you know, the war started taking a back seat again.
Piotr, very briefly, I'm afraid.
In my opinion, the war in Ukraine is not a European war in the sense you referred to in your question. So basically, it is not perceived as a major threat or a major challenge equally in the European Union. So we did some opinion polls at the ECFR, and it's quite obvious that there are countries in which the people would wish the Ukrainians to make compromise as quickly as possible, even at the expense of their national interests and territory. There are countries which want Ukrainians and the West to fight until the full victory. there are various perceptions, varying perceptions of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian refugees, and so on. And I think so. So in a sense, we have a very kind of a rich picture of approaches to the war in Ukraine. And I think what Nico said before is extremely important, because we are talking now, how many, 2 months ahead of the European election, but in a month's time or in 2 months, at the moment of the election, we can have a completely different situation. So we can have a wave of Ukrainian refugees in Europe again, and we can have developments on the ground which will change the context of this election completely. So, yeah.
Nico, you have the last word. What time questions? What would be the best argument for the strategic plans that our leaders are supposed to foster at the same time of these elections, which is one of these strange particularities of our European system? What, in your view, should be the #1 priority in their minds?
I think the #1 priority for the European Union must be to have the ability to act vis-à-vis the problems that are there to be solved. And I don't want to sound cynical, but the best we can do with the European Parliament elections is get over with this quickly, form a majority in the center, and build the European institutions, have them in a position to act, because I think the worst outcome could be that there will be a dragging on process after the elections, not forming a commission, not having the council really able, nobody really having a mandate to decide anything while the crisis continues. So let's get over with this quickly and form a majority in the center. That would be, I think, the best. Okay, so let's go and vote. Sorry for this very short discussion, and thank you to all of you.